Hello, High Rock. I'm John, one of the pastors, and I'm so glad to be with you today. I was also very happy to see so many of you on Easter Sunday. I loved setting up the petting zoo, watching our Director of Operations, Drew Hunter, trying to carry a baby goat while it squirmed and loudly protested. I loved the empanadas and the challenges of troubleshooting the popcorn machine and cotton candy machines. But the real highlight for me is always the baptisms. I especially appreciated the baptisms at our Cambridge congregation, where they had to set up the baptism pool outside. In case you don't know, it got cold that day. There was even one point when the rain turned into soft hail, which, by the way, is called grapple. Things you have to learn in New England. So when we baptized in Cambridge, you know that they really meant it. Baptism is such a powerful depiction of how God moves us from death to life, a symbol of spiritual rebirth. It's also a perfect connection to our scripture passage and our sermon series today, because Easter isn't just once a year. The early Christians worshiped on Sunday because it was the day that Jesus rose from death to life. Every Sunday is a mini Easter. Which begs the question, are we experiencing this move from death to life? Is Easter just a commemoration of what happened 2,000 years ago? Or is it a living reality that we experience today? After all, what does it matter if Jesus was raised from death to life 2,000 years ago if we are not able to experience that same power? If what happens in ancient Jerusalem stays in Jerusalem, then why should we even care? In order to consider how God desires to move us from death to life, even now, I invite us all to think about what death looks like in our lives. In what ways do you hope to move from death to life? And what do we even mean by death? One way to think about death is to see it as disconnection, tearing things apart. Physical death is the disconnection of our spirits and our bodies. But it's just one kind of disconnection, and not even the most important one. According to the Bible, physical death happened as a consequence of spiritual death. This spiritual death came about when the first humans sinned and experienced disconnection from God. As God had warned, they would die the day they ate of the tree, and in this sense, they did die that day. And as a result of their disconnection from God, they experienced disconnection from one another, yet another kind of death. And it's plaguing our world at a deeper level than quarantines and lockdowns. Another kind of disconnection is being divorced from purpose. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz, later wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. He argued that we cannot live without purpose and meaning. He witnessed firsthand how this kind of disconnection led to death. The fact is that without a higher purpose, people lost the drive to live and succumbed to both disease and despair more easily. He saw this not only as a Holocaust survivor, but as a professional psychiatrist. I want to offer a concise way to think about all of this. If death is disconnection, then life is connection. And our mission at High Rock is all about connection. We want to help connect people with God personally, with God's people, and with God's purposes. That's life. Death is the flip side. Death is disconnection from God personally and God's people and God's purposes. But there's one more element that's important to consider, and it's easy to remember because it's another P, and that's power. Death is being powerless. A body that is disconnected from life and breath is powerless to change its own condition. And we experience death even when we're physically alive if we are powerless to connect with God or one another or with a sense of higher purpose. Where do you need God's power to move from death to life? When I became a pastor at High Rock back in 2012, I was just starting a journey from death to life. In some ways, I was just beginning to lay hold of the power of Easter once again. Some of you have heard my story, but back in 2006, I was the solo pastor of a small independent church plant. And that year, my family received 2 diagnoses that rocked our world. Our youngest daughter was diagnosed with autism, which turned out to be quite severe. For her own safety, she eventually had to be placed in residential care, but not before years of struggling to get her the appropriate services. At nearly the same time, my wife was diagnosed with a deadly genetic mutation that led to multiple surgeries, including the total removal of her stomach, a double mastectomy, and several emergency surgeries, one of which accidentally paralyzed her right leg. Thankfully, only for a few weeks, but those were long weeks. During that time, my brother Eugene was such an incredible help to us and such a friend to me. But during Christmas of 2008, I found him dead in his apartment at just 41 years old. In the meantime, our marriage was imploding, our 2 older kids were struggling, and I had nothing left to give to the church or anyone else. By 2011, our church closed its doors, and I was looking for a job. I was disconnected, to say the least. I felt like I was surrounded by death. I felt disconnected from God personally. I was even angry with God, at least when I wasn't numb. I also felt disconnected from God's people. I felt like no one could understand or share my journey with me. And I certainly felt disconnected from God's purposes. I didn't want to even consider a career in ministry anymore. Seriously, the most interesting job posting I found was to become a CIA interrogator, and the job description sounded like it was tailored just for me. Through it all, I felt increasingly powerless. I felt like a train with no brakes heading toward a blown-out bridge. I had grown accustomed to leaning on my cleverness and hard work, but even my best efforts seemed to accomplish nothing. Eventually, I ran out of the energy to even try. I was powerless. I know that this will sound way too heavy for some of you, but for others, you've experienced what I experienced, maybe worse. Maybe you're in it right now. In a moment, I'm going to invite all of you to either contemplate some questions on your own or to engage with those around you. But I want you to understand something before we start. Whatever problems and challenges you experience, those are real problems. Those are real challenges. Don't worry about whether or not they seem big or small compared to others. What matters is that they seem big to you. After all, the challenges in my life are nothing compared to what some of you have faced or to what many people face daily around the world. If we're going to talk about experiencing the Easter journey of death to life in our lives today, we have to start with the ways that we are experiencing death right now. So please, take a few moments to contemplate these questions privately and prayerfully with God, or join with others around you to start a discussion. Welcome back, and I hope you had an engaging time of contemplation or engagement with those around you. Please consider following up with one another over a meal or coffee today and throughout the week. As I mentioned before, we're in a message series called Switch: How Easter Changes Everything. Last week, Pastor Megan talked about how Easter moves us from exclusion to inclusion. And today we're considering how Easter invites us to move from death to life. In this letter to the church in Ephesus, Paul addresses a mixed audience. There are Jewish people who see Jesus as the long-promised Messiah, and there are Gentiles, former pagans. The divisions between these two groups of people literally dominate the New Testament. What Paul has to say here about moving from death to life is actually critical to understanding how these two people groups, and any of us, even today, are actually all on the same journey together. Paul starts by saying emphatically that all people start out dead in their sins. We all start out disconnected from God, disconnected from one another, and disconnected from our divine purposes. And being dead, we're powerless to help ourselves. Not only that, but there is a power in the world that works against us. If you are uncomfortable with the idea of the devil, just drop the D and consider the power of evil in the world. That's what we're up against. We're dead in the water. This is where we all start our journey. But there's hope. After all, we're all in this together. In Paul's audience, there were some who were tempted to think that they had a special place of privilege because of their spiritual heritage. They didn't believe they were starting from being dead in the water. No, they were children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They grew up hearing the words of life. Sure, those Gentile pagans, they were dead in their sins, but surely the children of Israel were special, right? No. Absolutely not, says Paul. All of us start out dead. All of us are controlled by the flesh, that self-focused bent that leaves us vulnerable to disconnection and alienation from God and one another. When my wife and I were in the midst of that mess I described earlier, it was hard to even think straight. Even now, I'm horrified at the thoughts I was willing to entertain. At one point, it was almost a daily struggle to not think about how I could abandon my family and escape what felt like a trap. Actually, it was often no struggle at all, as I willingly indulged in such fantasies. In my flesh, as Paul calls it, I could imagine moving from death to life only by escaping what I felt was like a death trap. I mean, if I can't save my marriage or my family, maybe I can at least save myself. Paul says, this is all of us. This is where we all start. We were dead, entrapped by desires and thoughts bent towards favoring ourselves above all others. Thank God, there is more that unites us than simply being dead in the water. There is another step in this journey. So how do we escape from this death? How do we move beyond our inescapable self-focus? If Paul had been alive today, I imagine he might have depicted our situation as living inside the event horizon of a black hole. The event horizon is the distance at which nothing, not even light, can escape the gravitational pull. I like to think that the Apostle Paul would have been a nerd like me. Thankfully, not all is lost. Even if we cannot help ourselves, there is someone who can help us. As Paul writes, because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. It is by grace you have been saved. What does that even mean? The biblical word for grace is charis, and it means gift. It has a connotation of leaning towards or extending yourself to another, reaching out. We have been saved. We can be saved by God reaching out to us. Salvation, life, restored connection, all of it is a result of God first reaching out to us. It's not a reward for doing good. It's a gift we do not and cannot earn. It's grace. It's good news, but it's also incredibly counterintuitive and easy to forget. Even lifelong believers struggle with the idea that we can't do anything that will make God love us any more. And we can't do anything that will make God love us any less. Even lifelong followers of Christ fall into the trap of believing that the power of God is unleashed in our lives only when we do something for God, instead of believing the truth that it is God's grace that gives us the power and even the desire to do anything good. This struggle with grace really struck me in one of the stories that Jesus told. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, Jesus told a story of two men who went up to the temple to pray. One who was a Pharisee, a religious leader, and the other was a hated tax collector, someone who was viewed as a Roman collaborator and a traitor to the Jewish people. The crowds would, of course, have thought of the religious leader as a good person and the tax collector as a bad person. So Jesus said, "The religious leader prayed, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get.'" That's pretty good, right? I mean, how many of us set aside time to fast twice a week in order to dedicate ourselves to prayer? And how many of us truly give 1/10 of everything we gain? In contrast, the hated tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." According to Jesus, it was the tax collector who went home with a restored connection to God, not the religious leader who thought so highly of himself. It was the tax collector who asked for God's help and mercy, and so he received it. God offers us a gift, and all he had to do was accept the gift. That's grace. But what if this same scene played out again the next week, and the week after that, and a month after that, and a year after that? Sure, it's beautiful when the tax collector throws himself on God's mercy the first time, but week after week, month after month? Eventually, we expect him to not need God's grace so much anymore. Eventually, we expect him to demonstrate that he's worthy of reconnection with God. In other words, eventually, we expect him to become the Pharisee. That's the scandal of grace. Not just that our connection to God comes as a gift, but that it's always a gift. There is nothing we can do to earn it, and there's nothing we can do to deserve it. And when we forget that foundational truth, we start to live a lie. We start pretending we're doing better than we are. We start to show up for church not to seek life and connection, but to be seen by others. We say we'll pray for others when we have no real intention to. We start talking about the Bible like we just read it in our morning devotions, rather than be honest that we're reaching back to something we read years ago or heard in a sermon. We start to live a life of image management rather than an authentic life which rests on the inescapable truth that it's all a gift. Even being alive is a gift. You didn't give birth to yourself, not physically, not spiritually. It's all a gift. But if the good things we do can never earn God's favor, then is there any place for doing good? Absolutely. But we have to start with grace. It is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Once we understand that, we can see where doing good comes in the very next sentence. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Doing good doesn't bring God into our lives. No. It's when God comes into our lives that we can finally start doing good. We can move from death to life when we act out of gratitude for what God has done rather than acting out of anxiety over what we think we have to do. It's like two different fuels. Our hearts were designed to run on gratitude. They'll run on anxiety and pride in a pinch, but it's going to ruin the engine over time. The tragic reality in Ephesus was that most Jewish people of that day already believed in God's grace. They could see that even the 10 Commandments started first with grace, which began with these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That's grace. God connected with them before any of them even had a law to obey. The problem is not that they didn't believe in grace. The problem is that they believed in grace for them, for Israel, for the Jewish people, but not for the Gentiles. Those outsider Gentiles had to do the right things before God would ever accept them. But Paul says, no. We all start out dead in the water. We all need God's grace and power. If you are someone who has relied on God's grace in your life, are there other people that you don't think deserve it in the same way that you did? So, if it's hard to hold on to the idea of grace, and if it's so easy to slip into the anxiety of trying to earn the right to be loved, how do we navigate that challenge? How do we live day by day in the stream of God's grace? If you ask 20 different followers of Jesus, I'm sure you'd get at least a dozen answers. In fact, I'd encourage you to do so. I could probably stop talking right now. If you could do that one thing, I would be incredibly encouraged as one of your pastors. Okay, asking 20 people is probably a bit much. But how about 3? Could you ask 3 people this week? 3 people whose faith you respect? Ask them how they stay in the stream of God's grace? Honestly, I'd be happy if you did that with even one person, but I'm going to be bold and ask you for 3. Just open up to Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 10 and ask, how do you do this in your life? How do you hold on to grace rather than slipping back into trying to earn God's favor or prove your worth? How do you serve God out of gratitude rather than fear or anxiety or trying to keep up an image? In the meantime, I'll share several practices that I've discovered to be helpful during and after those dark times I described earlier. For me, it all comes down to gratitude. I can easily become pessimistic, jealous, discouraged. I have to practice remembering that every good thing in this life is a gift. So how do I do that? I have one scheduled way and one spontaneous way. First, on my calendar, I have a reminder to put something into my good note jar every Sunday evening. The idea is that over time, you create a roadmap of all the traveling mercies God has given you along the way. A second practice I've been trying to do is to give thanks to God immediately when I experience something good. If someone invites me to something, I want to thank God right then and there that I have a life-giving connection to others. If something fills me with joy, I'll try to stop, even if just for a moment, to give thanks. Anytime I experience joy, I want to thank God. I want it to become a reflex. The older I've grown, the more important that beauty has become to me. And when I was young, the truth is what mattered. As I grew older, goodness is where it was at. But around 5 years ago, I realized that I had neglected beauty. I used to hike to bag peaks and conquer mountains. Now I'm much more inclined to appreciate the beauty of what God has created and the incredible privilege I have to enjoy it and even share it with others. So actually, I have a third practice as well, and it's more recent. You see, gratitude is contagious. So when I'm not feeling particularly grateful, I'll often try to bring some cheer to someone else, usually a stranger. I was actually inspired to start doing this because of Pastor Megan. We were in the airport back at O'Hare, coming back from a conference, grabbing a bite to eat, and our server asked us how we were doing, barely looking up. But Megan looked directly at her and said, "How are you doing?" Our server immediately looked up, put down her pen, and said, "You're the first person who's asked me that all day. It's been a rough day." We all need grace. We all need to be loved just because we are human beings, just because we are all created in God's image. When I see the immediate and profound effect that grace has on others, I cannot help but become grateful for the grace God constantly extends to me. We're all on the same journey. We all start out dead in the water, and we all need grace. In a few weeks, I'll be on a 6-week sabbatical, and it will probably be no surprise to you that I'll be spending my time hiking. My plan is a one-way ticket to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, and then to start walking back home for 40 days. I'm calling it 40 Days in the Wilderness, just like Moses and Jesus, but not really. I just want to make it sound sufficiently spiritual. One of the things I am most looking forward to are the people on the trail. When you hike a long trail, you end up having conversations and connections with all kinds of people with whom you might never otherwise connect with when off the trail. But sharing the same journey gives you a kind of fellowship that is hard to describe. No matter how different you are, you're sharing the same experiences, the same challenges, the same journey, literally. Every night you share stories. Every morning you share personal plans and weather reports. It's such a powerful connection that many thru hikers form lifelong relationships and even have reunions. I believe Paul is moving all of us toward the same goal. Whether Jew or Greek, male or female, rich or poor, high school dropout or multiple PhDs, queer or straight, we all share the same starting point, and we're all invited into the same journey, moving from death to life. Deserve ain't got nothing to do with it. It's all about God's incredible grace and generosity. Sometimes I hear people wonder how they're supposed to have community with people when they have nothing in common. I heard this question from a number of people in our Disunity in Christ reading groups. I believe Paul's answer and God's answer is that we have so much in common if we're focused on the right things. We may all have different backgrounds and personalities, but we share the most incredible journey with one another, a journey from death to life, powered by the grace of God in Jesus Christ. How are you doing today? Maybe you're someone who long ago accepted God's gift of grace. You said yes to this journey. Thank God. Just remember that it's a journey that starts with grace and ends with grace. Don't lose track. Or maybe you're someone who never even understood what the invitation is, that you matter to God not because of what you do, but just because you are. God is reaching out to you even now. All of us are invited to walk the same path together from death to life. From disconnection to deep connection. So let's go.